Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. And today we are going to be looking at the game between Magnus Carlsen and Grandmaster Hans Nieman, one of the most important games in all of chess history. And I'm gonna give a quick insight of why this game is so very important. So, this game is very important, of course, because in 2022, in the Sinquin Field Cup, which is a very strong tournament played by the best players in the world. In round 3, Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen and Hans Nieman faced. So of course Magnus was playing the white pieces, as you can see, and Hans was playing the black pieces here in a classical game of chess. So they both have an hour and 30 minutes on their clock, which is a lot of time for chess, of course. And it's going to be a long strategic game because of all the time they have. It's not going to be sort of blitz where you have so many blunders or so many mistakes or rapid, but a very precise game and a very well thought game. So basically testing all of their strategic and calculation skills. So we're going to look at this game detailed because this game has a lot of drama behind it and many posts and many lawsuits and messages and all of that. You can find the drama elsewhere, but we're just going to look for the chess. And the insight is that 2 weeks after this game, Magnus Carlsen publicly stated that he thought Hans Nieman was cheating, using outside help, using an engine, a computer engine, to cheat and get the best moves to beat him. Because remember, beating Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, or the greatest of all time of chess, is a very big privilege. So anyone would want to beat him because that gives them a name. So they'll get public recognition, people will know who they are. So he thought that Hans was cheating against him. Of course, Hans denied any of this cheating, and a big scandal went on between the chess world. And this will all happen 4 years ago. It's all died down a bit, of course, but even till this day, there is a lot of tension between the two players whenever they meet, and it is a very deep story. But we're just going to be looking at the chess, as I said, and look at the game. Was Hans too strong? Did he play a good game, or did Magnus just play a bad game? What was going on? Let's look at the game. So the game starts, Magnus is playing the white pieces, of course, and he plays the move d4, which is obviously very standard. You open up your bishop, you open up your queen, and you also place your pawn directly in the center to control the key central squares. Grandmaster Hans Nieman, of course, replies with knight to f6. It's kind of his trademark after d4. He usually replies with this move, and of course the idea is clear. You're developing your knight, you're also controlling these two central squares, and at the same time, you're developing a piece. Look, you've bought out a piece. So white has put a pawn in the center and opened up his bishop, but he hasn't bought out a piece just yet, but Hans has. Now, white can go with many ways, but of course Magnus decides to go with the most common way, which is the move c4. So he moves his pawn to c4, and as you can see, it also opens up another diagonal for the queen. And the idea behind c4 is very simple. You're just going to get more space with your pawn so that you have more space in the center. And Magnus and Hans, of course, this is just theory and principles. They're not thinking about this at all. They've studied this with an engine or a computer at home. So then black decides to reply with e6. And as you can see, this idea is very sort of obvious, that he just wants to bring out his bishop so that he can castle, because he's already bought his knight out. And he wants to castle kingside. He wants to put his king immediately to safety. You want your king safe against Magnus, believe me. So you just want to bring out your bishop and somehow after that put it on a square where it's going to be very nice and active, and then you're going to castle your king. So Magnus decides to reply with knight to c3, developing another knight and also getting control of the center. Hans decides to play bishop b4, and now we can see the idea coming to life. Now Hans on the very next turn can castle, and at the same time he's also developed a pin. Now this knight can't move anywhere because behind it is the king. So if I move this knight anywhere, it's actually an illegal move. See? It's not even letting me do it. So because the bishop would look directly at the king, so that's not allowed. Now Magnus decides to play g3. So this actually probably isn't that very common in this position. Usually you would play knight f3, queen c2 maybe, control a long diagonal, or just bring out your knight. But he decides to play g3. I'm assuming he did this because he was very confident against Hans. He's like, you know what, because at the time Hans is only 17 years old. So he's probably thinking, you know what, this guy's young, I'm the greatest of all time. Let me just play some weird variation so that I can easily beat this guy. Only to accuse him of cheating 2 weeks later. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so he's decided to play this move g3 because he wants to put his bishop on the longest diagonal on the board and make it very active. At the same time, he's probably going to follow with knight f3, and so that he can also castle kingside. So now what happens? Hans decides to castle. He's been preparing this from the beginning. He wanted to castle fast, clearly. Magnus goes ahead with bishop g2 as he was planning, and now this move d4 is being played. This is a very nice move because you're just putting your pawn in the center. Now you've also finally put a pawn in the center. Remember before, e6, it's not really in the center. But now you put a pawn in the center, you also attack this pawn, and you also shut down this diagonal for temporarily, of course, for the bishop. And now you don't look at the complete end. Now it's you're kind of closing the door, right? So you have your pawn in the center. This is obviously very good. You've also slightly opened up your bishop. And this is all, of course, theory. So now Magnus decides to play a3. So he's pushing his pawn. He's saying to Hans's bishop, you better get out of here. And this is a pretty tricky decision because actually you either have to go here or take the knight. Because if actually you go here, this is a big mistake because you're actually going to lose in like 6 moves because you get your bishop trapped after the move b4. b4, attack the bishop, you have 1 square, you're forced back, and then the brilliant, very, very nice move c5 and completely trap the bishop, attack the pawn here, and after that, when the bishop moves away, you're gonna lose it because if you go here, the pawn takes you, and if you stay here, you also lose the bishop. So that's basically what would happen if he went back. Of course, Hans is a grandmaster, he's not going to do that. And you also have the option of going bishop to e7, but retreating, it's not really necessary. So Hans is like, I don't want to retreat, I don't want to get my bishop trapped, let me just take your knight, and I'll take back. So you might notice here that Magnus kind of has weakened his pawn structure. What do I mean by this? Because we're here to learn, of course, we should notice that even though it's something very small, like it's not even that important if you don't recognize it. But as I said, because we're here to learn, it's good to notice that his pawn structure is a bit weak. He has this isolated pawn, he has these double pawns, and this might haunt him later. Of course, now this has no significance for the game. Like, this is good for right now. He just has pawns in the center that are going to help him control. And this, what is Hans going to do right now? It's controlled by the bishop, and it's also being controlled by the rook. They're keeping an eye on the pawn. So there's nothing that's going to sort of give Magnus trouble right now. But maybe later in the game it might. So now he has these double pawns and this isolated pawn, which is considered weak sometimes, but as I said, it's completely fine now. Now Hans decides to play d takes c4. Now, what is his idea? He just wants to win a pawn, and he's also planning c5, which is a very nice idea, which we'll look at. And now Magnus decides to play the best move, which is knight f3. You're developing another piece to a very good square, of course, and you're preparing to castle. Very normal. Now Hans plays c5. This is a very good move, clearly, because you're putting another pawn and putting pressure on Magnus's central pawn. And if Magnus were to take, which you could, it's not too great because actually the queens could get traded. And after the queens get traded, notice the white king had to move, while the black king has already castled. The black king has castled. He's been safe for a couple of moves now. But the white king had to move, which means he can't castle for the rest of the game. He's going to stay in the center, all there, and he could be a bit unsafe. The rook might swing in, knight maneuvers. You never know. It could get a bit unsafe, so you don't want to do this. Why take that risk, right? So instead, what Magnus does is he castles his king to safety, which is the best thing to do, of course. And Hans here, now Magnus is threatening to take the pawn, because now if you take the pawn, the queen would take the queen, the rook would take the queen, and then that's just fine. So Hans, of course, takes the pawn, and then Magnus takes the pawn back with his queen. So he's actually offering to trade queens already, very, very early on, only 10 moves into this game, which is kind of, you know, kind of taking the fire out of the game. Because remember, when the queens are there, there's more attacks, there's more possibilities, but he's already trying to simplify the game. Now, this pawn, Hans's pawn is also under attack here, considering that. So he's also threatening to win this pawn. And remember, Hans for the second is a pawn up. He did win a pawn. Remember? Here. He took this pawn here. And then Magnus never got a pawn back after that. So here, Hans decides to develop his knight and attack Magnus's queen. So he's actually offering Magnus the pawn back, because if you try and be greedy and cling on to this pawn, So the only way I think to cling on is play b5. This is very, very bad. I mean, ugh, because you open up the knight. If it moves anywhere, you give the bishop the entire diagonal to attack the rook. This is a very weak pawn, and you can just play a4. And if takes, you have these two weak pawns. You have the bishop on the diagonal that looks at the rook. This is very, very bad for Hans. But of course, he's not going to do that. So instead, he gives Magnus up the pawn. But now he's saying, I have a very good development. I have two knights out. My queen is on an open file. My rook can swing in. My bishop will get in the game somehow. This is all very good for me. I don't have any problems. Take your pawn back. We're even in material. I'm fine with it. So now what happens? Hans plays e5. Very standard move. This is actually the best way to open up your bishop now, because if you look a move back, this bishop is kind of suffocating. You only have one move to go here, and even this is completely useless. You don't do anything. But you play e5, you get a pawn in the center, also open up the bishop. This is a very good move. Now, Magnus decides to develop his own bishop, and now he's also pinning the knight to the queen. But what else has he done? He's also connected his rooks. So one of the rooks could come in and win a tempo on his queen and get the open file. So all of a sudden Magnus is being a bit ambitious here, right? And you also have this pin. So what is Hans going to do? He plays h6, very cool, calm, and collected. He's like, I'm just going to kick away your bishop. If you go back, you actually get your bishop trapped. I could go and play g4, but this doesn't work because you sacrifice the knight. And if you sacrifice the knight, this actually works, even though you're down material, but it works because the king is very open. Of course, that wouldn't happen in the game, but he plays h6, and here, as we can see, he goes for the idea. He lets his bishop hang. He's like, you know what, I can leave it there for free, but he's, of course, winning a tempo on his queen. So, of course, if you take the bishop, that's a huge mistake, because then you lose your queen, and yeah, that's just completely losing. So, now Hans has a decision to make. He can go maybe here, he can go here, as long as he moves his queen away from the danger. Even queen e7 is fine. These are all pretty standard moves. But there is actually a very nice idea here. An idea which somebody to play against Magnus is very, very hard. There's actually a much better move here. And that move Hans finds. Bishop e6. And this looks like something you're gonna. This is confusing, for the least. Let's just say for the least, because you have to calculate very, very well to be able to play this. Sometimes this might not work, but he plays bishop e6, and the idea at first looks simple, right? And it is simple actually. You just attack the queen. If you take my queen, I'll take your queen. But you do very much in many positions have to calculate this very, very thoroughly, like everything. But Hans, of course, has calculated this well. He's attacking the queen, and he's also, at the same time, after his queen moves, his rooks are going to connect. We'll see that in a minute. Now, let's see what happens next. The rook takes the queen, and then the bishop takes the queen. So we have an equal trade of queen. The material is the same, and then the rook takes the rook, and the rook takes the rook. So we've had a mega trade here. Let's go back. What happens is the rook takes the queen, and now you cannot take back the rook because you have to win back the queen. So you get back the queen, but also remember, when the bishop goes here, I do attack the pawn, which is going to come in handy. So now you can take any rook you want. You can also just retreat, but it's not too good to retreat. So he decides to take the rook on a8, and the rook takes the rook back. And now we have an equal position of material and also positionally. Everything is in the balance. Nothing crazy is going on. But for a classical game, maybe it's a bit weird. 15 moves, a lot of material has been traded. So what's going to happen next? How is Hans going to win this so beautifully that Magnus Carlsen will accuse him of cheating? What is going to happen in this endgame? Because you're effectively playing against like the king of endgames. Magnus is known for that. He's the best endgame player of all time. There's no debate. So to beat Magnus in his own style, that must have frustrated him a lot, and clearly it did. So let's see. Now, wow, okay, so Magnus decides to go for another trade. He wants to take the knight as well. So he's trading. So I'm probably thinking that Magnus's mentality is that Hans doesn't have as much experience as I do. He's still 17. I've been playing this game for like longer than he's probably ever even dreamed of playing the game. So clearly Magnus has more experience here, and that means he's going to have a lot more endgame sort of tactics or sort of positions memorized than Hans has. So he's clearly confident that he's going to win in the endgame. That's why he's trading all these pieces. We already just have 3 pieces left, and of course the pawns. So let's see what's going to happen. Now, Magnus decides to put his king here. So as you can see, the computer gives us a bit of an inaccuracy, but it's nothing too big. Maybe because you're putting your king directly into this danger. But he wants to bring out his king probably to activity somehow and get his king out from staying here. Because remember, in the end game, kings are going to become a very active piece. But Hans's path to make his king active is kind of clear. So at least that's good for him. I mean, you can very easily ring your king. Or even just like this. So, let's see. Now, there is something to note. Remember, this pawn was isolated and then this became weak. This is gonna maybe be a bit of a problem for Magnus. And that's why, as you can see, the computer gives the tiniest advantage to Hans. Because these 2 pawns are isolated, they're weak. These 2 pawns are connected, they're right next to each other, they can defend each other, these can't. These 2 pawns are the problem for Magnus. Hans has these double pawns, but they're perfectly fine because the king can just come and defend, and there's nothing that's going to threaten to win them. So Hans is doing pretty good here, probably better than he could have asked for right now, because this is a very good position, and your rook can swing into the open file. This is all very, very good for Hans Nieman. But Magnus, you have these isolated pawns, you have this, it's a little bit shaky. But let's see what happens. Now Hans decides to do this move, which is very, very good. You put your rook on the open file, on the only open file on the board, and you're getting your rook to activity, of course, and this is a very good move. And now Magnus decides, you know what, I want to put my king even more towards the center, because not towards the center just yet, of course, but he wants to bring his king out into the game. Remember, it was here, so he spent 2 moves moving his king, rather than maybe moving his pieces. So let's see what's on his mind. Now, Hans decides to go knight to a5. Now, this might look weird at first, because I think we've all been taught in chess that knights, or usually any pieces on the board, on the edge of the board are not very good. But have a think, why do you think Hans might have done this? I think personally it's a very good move. This idea, when I see it, it's very clear to me. I immediately know what Hans wants to do. He wants to move his knight from here to here and attack the rook and gain an excellent square. This is a very good square for the knight. And you're defended by the bishop. Later, you might even push your pawns to defend the knight there. That would be very good. So you're going to move your knight here, push this pawn, and defend your knight. And it's going to cement there. It's going to stay there. Nothing can kick it out. This is a pretty good move by Hans. Forget what this inaccuracy, what this computer is saying. This is a very good move. So now the rook decides to go here. And clearly Magnus is a bit annoyed that Hans's rook has so much activity on this open file. He wants to trade the rooks, and if you do trade the rooks, then you might lose that tiny advantage. So Hans knows better, and he goes rook c8. Now he's on the same file as that weak pawn. If he moves the bishop anywhere, just say here, here, you're going to have a direct attack on that weak pawn. The knight is coming in. The bishop, it's looking tiny bit bad for Magnus. Again, bad in sort of that he's not losing or anything, but it's just much more comfortable for Hans to play. Like, he probably doesn't need to think on his moves too much, but Magnus does, because this position's a bit uncomfortable for Magnus. So let's see. Now, of course, Magnus decides to go and play knight to d2, because he has actually done 2 things. He's also going to attack Hans's bishop, but at the same time, he's also opened up his bishop, attacking this pawn. Now, he can't take this pawn just yet because, of course, it's defended by the knight, but it is a threat and it is something that can come in handy later in the future. And also, you're also going to try and trade the bishop off. So let's see what Hans is going to respond with. This is a good move. Hans, very cool, very calm, bishop e6. Very calmly, just puts his bishop back. He's like, you can't take my pawn. Sure, you've opened up your bishop on the longest diagonal, but I'm fine with that. And my knight is defending it for the time being. And at the same time, I've also opened up my rook on this pawn. So you have to watch your back now, Magnus. Magnus decides to go c4, which is a bit of an inaccuracy. But what is the idea? Magnus's idea is that he's actually giving up a pawn, because this pawn can be taken 3 different ways. 1, 2, 3. With the knight as well. So Hans decides to take with the bishop, and the idea is that now I'm going to take this bishop. So now Magnus has traded even more pieces. He's traded off the bishop, and Hans decides to take with, not the knight, because if you take with the knight, actually, he gets the pawn. Then you give up the guard of the pawn, because remember, the knight was here to defend the pawn. So instead you should take with the rook. Now Hans is up one pawn. Hans just won a pawn. So I don't know why Magnus maybe gave up this pawn. He probably saw something. I think he probably wanted to put his rook somewhere on the end of the board and sort of keep his bishop more open. So he's given up a pawn, believing that this is gonna give him the chance to make his pieces better. And he isn't wrong, of course. But of course, this position, as you can see, is still in the balance. But when you kind of know Hans is that little bit better, and you give him the pawn, it's strategically maybe wrong, but let's see. It's not the right thing to do. Now again, is it the right thing to do as a principle of chess, maybe to give up that pawn and get the activity, and even the computer says it's fine, yes. But when your position's already uncomfortable, giving up a pawn, it's probably just giving Hans more chances, right? Why would you give more chances? He already has clearly enough sort of chances to win. So now he goes rook to d8, Magnus, and as we can see already he's improved his rook, he's given a check. Hans escapes, he puts his king here, and now Magnus decides to put his bishop here. As you can see, his pieces have already improved. His bishop is on a very good diagonal. Look at the bishop, like a spider, stretching all across the board, and he's also attacking the rook. And now the rook decides to go here, so he wants to go here and defend his pawn, because now the rook might be able to come in later and attack this pawn twice. And if you move it, you're going to lose the other pawn. Let me just show this. Let's say Hans goes here. Then actually, let's say you go rook to d7. Now this pawn is being attacked twice. So let's say you can't even play this because then you lose a pawn. Another one. And then this is weak. So yeah, then Magnus would actually be better. So instead, that's why Hans decides to go here, because he wants to keep his bishop, his rook on the second to last rank for white side, and his second rank. So he's keeping his rook where his pawns are, and he's keeping an eye on all of his pawns. He's like, you know what, I'm going to be the guard here and control everything. Make sure Magnus doesn't get any tricks up his sleeve. So now Magnus decides to go here. This is a bit he's just trying to win the pawn here, but you can just solve this very easily. Just play a6, and now the pawn is defended by the other pawn. And now he decides to move his rook back. This is a bit of a questionable move, I'm going to be honest, because you're moving your rook here, but you know you're not going to win the pawn because it's defended by the knight and the rook. So this was a bit weird by Magnus. But anyhow, now Hans decides to play the move f5. So he's just trying to move his pawns now because he doesn't really have much to do or much to lose from this move. So now Magnus decides to go rook here. This is a bit of an inaccuracy, but it looks like a very perfectly normal move because he just wants to win this pawn very simply. Now, you could also just go and defend the pawn like this, but apparently the engine doesn't like this. Hans didn't like it either because you can just play e4 and gain more space with your pawns, which is a very good move. So instead, what's going to happen now is that Magnus makes a mistake. He plays the move g4, which looks like a very reasonable move. So when you play this move e4, you have a very nice structure. These pawns are defending each other. The king can always come in and defend. The rook also, remember, this idea is there. The knight can go here. So Hans has his structure. He knows what he's going to do. But Magnus goes g4, and the idea is that if I take this pawn, the rook would take the pawn, and Magnus probably thought that this is going to be a weak pawn, and he would be right. After I play h5, this is probably just not that bad for white. Again, that still small advantage exists, but it's not bad. And of course h5 is necessary because then you just give up the pawn. You can play f5, but f5 is not as good because we can just go rook f4 and win the pawn. And again, you can't go with the king because actually this would be a big mistake because I can go e4 and win a pawn by a pin. So g4, why is it a mistake? Because remember, if I just take the pawn and be careless, it's not a mistake because the rook takes the pawn and it's perfectly fine. So then what's the mistake? What is Magnus missing here? Hans goes rook c5 and he completely ignores this pawn is hanging because he's going to get the bishop. Again, you take the pawn, I take your bishop, I win the game. So instead, what does Magnus do here? Magnus decides to retreat the bishop to a2. What is his point here? He wants to keep this bishop on the diagonal and attack this pawn. Because remember, this pawn is going to potentially be targeted by the rook, just like this later as well. And now you can see the engine is leaning a lot more for Hans. Hans has a big advantage now. And, okay, maybe not that big, but sort of enough to cause some damage, right? And this move g4 by Magnus was clearly a mistake. So can he capitalize? But he makes a mistake. Knight c4. And this isn't too great, because this knight in this endgame is going to be much more powerful than the bishop. And you're allowing him to trade pieces and get into a rook endgame. And rook endgames, almost everybody knows, it's very hard to lose. This is probably going to be a draw. So, yeah, it's just not the way you want to go. You want to be a bit more ambitious than that. So he's offering Magnus to trade the minor pieces, which is the bishop and the knight. And after that, you're going to be in a rook endgame, and your chances to win kind of decrease. Which, of course, when you have an advantage, you don't want to do, right? So then, Magnus, after this, doesn't trade, and he plays a4. And I honestly couldn't tell you what the idea behind this is. I guess he's just searching for moves to make at this point. So, yeah, a4 is a bit of a weird move. And as you can see, the engine also thinks it's a bit of a weird move. Maybe the concept is that he wants to play a5 later and make a backward pawn. But for right now, a4 isn't of any use. It's not going to help him at all. And also remember, if you take this pawn, apparently then it's just going to be completely lost, because knight takes a3. You're also coming and attacking this pawn, and then the rook could later swing in and take this pawn. So that's not too great either. So instead, what happens? We're going to do the move a4, and then Hans decides to go knight d6. He's attacking the rook, and he's also defending this pawn, and this is a very good move. And also, later, if you take this pawn, the knight is also defending. So effectively, the knight has been moved to an excellent square, and you're defending the square. This was the idea, remember? So the knight is on a very good square. He's being a complete monster right now. Look at that, just like an octopus, defending everything. So the knight is being very good. The bishop is controlling the diagonal, but the only threat he has is trying to win this pawn with the rook, which is even defended by the knight now. So now Magnus makes a big mistake and goes rook to e7. This is a big blunder, as you can see, because it's not, again, you're just not doing anything with this move. The knight is defending. The knight is defending this. What are you trying to win? You can't win the pawn like this. This knight is holding everything together. So maybe he's thinking that if I take, then the rook would take, and then I go here. That would probably be a very good idea, but it doesn't work. What is this idea? Let me show it to you guys. So let's say here black decides to play a random move, just for sake of example. Let's say he plays a5. So let's say you take this pawn, and then I take with the rook, because of course, if I take with the knight, then I lose the pawn, just like this, and then yeah, that's going to be very bad. So let's say I take with the rook, and then he might be thinking that I can just go here and attack his knight, and then I'm going to win the pawn if he moves away. But you can just go rook f6 and defend the knight, and the pawn is also defended, and yeah, this is just a very normal position. But back to rook to e7, this is a big mistake by Magnus. And why? Because before, when you played this move g4, if you take, it wasn't a big mistake because you had that sort of compensation that the rook will get the pawn. But now Hans can actually just take this pawn, and you can't even take this pawn back because you're going to lose a rook. So now Hans is 2 pawn up. He's 2 pawns up because Magnus already gave him 1 pawn. Now he gives him another pawn. So you're 2 pawns up, and this is very hard to hold. So let's see what Magnus is thinking. Now Magnus decides to go here. He clearly just wants to attack the knight and move it away. And Hans decides to play the move e3. Now, this is a very, very good idea. Sacrificing the knight. But if you take, I give a check on the last rank here. And now that I give a check on the last rank, you actually only have 1 move to do, because this is kind of like checkmate, right? You can't escape because of the pawn. You go here, and you might think, oh, why did I give up the knight? But actually, you can take the rook with check, king takes, and pawn here. What a move. Just a silent move. You have an extra bishop, but you can't stop the pawn from promoting, and he's going to make a queen, and he's going to win this in a couple moves. So instead, of course, Magnus can't take the knight, and he decides to play f takes e3. So he just takes the pawn, because Hans did give a free pawn. So why would he give a free pawn? Knight e4, what a move. Now you've put your knight in an even better position, even giving up a pawn, but you're threatening checkmate. This is checkmate as long as the rook doesn't stay on this file. So if the rook were to ever move away from the file, so let's just say you move here, this is just mate in 1, and Hans would win the game. And also you're giving up the pawn. This is an interesting idea. You're giving up the pawn with check for this idea. But the king can go to g6, and mate in 1 is still being threatened. And this isn't too great. So yeah, and the knight can always have these nice maneuvers. This is also very dangerous already for Magnus, as we can see. So obviously you can't take the pawn either, but instead what Magnus decides to do goes king to f1, which is the best move because you're escaping the mate threat. And now Hans plays a bit of an inaccuracy, which looks fine. He gives this check, which the computer doesn't like. The king runs to g2, and now he decides to play rook to c2, which is, as you can see, the only move to keep that small advantage. It's a fork, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn, and you're going to try to win one of them. And here, you can't defend both of them. Maybe you might think you can go here, but then you just hang a bishop, because it would defend the pawn, but the rook just takes the bishop. So what does he do? He takes bishop takes f7. So now actually Magnus has gained back the 2 pawns, because Hans gave up a pawn here, and he's also given up a pawn here. But he gets the pawn back with a check, and then the king runs away, and then he can also just win the pawn back, but that would be a big mistake. And he decides to give a check, king runs up, check again, king down, and then he runs the king away. Because if you don't move the king from there, let's say you play a move like this, or maybe not that, let's just say you play, what's the most natural looking move here? Maybe, let's just say take the pawn. That would actually not be a good move, because then you could give a discovered check. So you could go here, check, let's say, until you run away here, then I just take the pawn, and then this is perfectly fine. So instead what's going to happen here is that Hans decides to run king to g6 so that you have no discovered checks or discovered attacks. So now he decides to go here, and he's trying to attack the knight and move it away, and here you go rook to e1. So you give up the knight, but this is actually a pin. So if you take the knight, I take the rook and I win the game. So very good move by Hans. And now he goes rook here and gives the check. Now here there's actually only one move that works. And let's see what this move is. The move is actually king to g6, which looks very weird, because you might think that the only move might be here, because you need to go attack the bishop and defend the knight. But apparently king to g6 is the only move. I don't know why maybe this doesn't count as very good. It counts as equal, but if you go king to g6 is much better. What's the idea? Is that I can't take the knight because the bishop was defending the rook, and when you take the knight and give this check, now the rook is hanging, so I take the rook. So I'll just take the rook. So now what happens is Magnus decides to go here, and he's trying to defend his bishop, which as you can see is not a very good move. You should probably have just maybe taken the knight, or done, sorry, not taken the knight. Probably just go rook to f4, and that way you're more happy, because if you take the bishop, I take the knight, and this is probably Magnus can draw this because this pawn is hanging. You can go here and sort of maybe gobble up the pawns. So let's see. Now he goes here. Hans decides to go here. He's moved his knight out of the way, and now you have a very dangerous knight, which is threatening to go to some serious squares, even maybe some checkmating threats later if you bring the king in. So now the bishop decides to go to f7, and now this is actually a discovered check, because I move here, I give the king a check, but if I play carelessly, I'm going to lose the game. If I think that, oh, I can take this bishop for free, you lose the rook. So instead, what do? You play king to f5, which looks bad. You look, oh, I just give up a rook. But no, it's a fork. Now I give a fork and I win back the rook. This is a very important move to find. If you don't find this move, you've lost the game. So I give the king and I give the rook a check. And now the king moves away and I win the rook. Now we're in an endgame, actually. We're in an endgame with a knight, 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns versus 1, 2, 3 pawns and a bishop. So black has 1 pawn, but in this endgame, a knight is better. A knight will win the game. That's why when this move played, if you remember this place, where Hans played knight to c4, which wasn't a very good move, that the bishop could take the knight and the rook could take the knight. Sorry, the rook could take the bishop back. This was apparently, according to the engine, equal. Why? Because the knight got traded off. Because the engine saw 20, 30 moves into the future that this knight is going to be a much better piece in this endgame. So that's why you should get rid of it now. But Magnus didn't get rid of it. Instead, he kept his bishop and he let Hans keep his very good knight. And here he gets this fork, and now we're in this endgame where only black can win. White is never going to win this. You're not going to see white win this endgame. Simple. Because you're down a pawn and the knight is very active. And all your pawns are isolated. He has two connected pawns. They're both next to each other, but every single white pawn is isolated. This is alone, this is alone, this is alone. So now he decides to play here. Magnus, of course, wants to play the move b5, and he's just basically trying to create a backward pawn, and you can't go here and try to win the pawn because the bishop controls these squares. Now Hans decides to go king to e5, which is the only move, because now you have a lot of options. You can go here and win this pawn. You can actually just go here and win this pawn. There's nothing that's going to stop you. This is a completely winning endgame now. And now the king goes up. As soon as Magnus traded the rooks, it just became much, much easier for Hans to win this. And what is Magnus's idea? Very simple. I'm going to go and I'm going to try to win the pawn back. But Hans has to find one move here, and he finds it knight to f1. Knight to f1, what a move. Forking these three pieces at the same time. If you take the pawn, I will actually take the h2 pawn, and then I win the pawn back, and then I'm perfectly happy. But instead, Magnus doesn't want to go and take the pawn. He decides, I'm just going to go and play king to f2 instead, giving up yet another pawn. He thinks that maybe this will give him some hope. Hans is like, nope, I don't care. I think that's fine. This is fine for me if I take an extra pawn. This is not me being greedy. This is me just winning an extra pawn. So now, again, Hans is up 2 pawns for the second time in the game, and you have 2 pawns that are going to march up the board and become queens. And this bishop alone is not enough to stop it, because you're going to have the king that's going to come in, you have the knight that's already there, and these pieces are all going to be working together, and Magnus can't stop this in any way. So he moves his pawn. He's actually given up yet another pawn, and now what does Hans do? He takes this pawn. Now he's up 3 pawns. Magnus gives up this pawn. He's just becoming very desperate, maybe some sort of drawing tactic here, and he plays this move, attacking this pawn. Even this doesn't make a difference, I'm going to be honest, because this knight is defending it. I think he wants to go here and win this pawn, which he will win, and then get this and try to promote his own pawn very fast. That's literally the only hope he has, because there's no way you can save this. Because if Hans has played this well, he's going to win the game. So yeah, Magnus knows that. Then the king goes here, you defend the pawn. The bishop goes here, and yeah, the idea I said, he wants to win these pawns. Hans is like, perfectly fine by me. Knight f3. He takes the pawn, and he goes knight e5. You've given up another pawn now. Magnus is getting some hope maybe. He gets the pawn. So Magnus actually won 2 pawns back, and now his pawn, 1, 2, 3 places away from becoming a queen. So Magnus, effectively, Hans has given him some hope for some reason here. But again, there's also kind of nothing to do to defend this pawn. So yeah, it's not really for some reason. Misspoke there. So what is going to happen here? This is a completely winning endgame for Hans, because even though this pawn is only 3 squares away from becoming a queen, he's too slow. He's simply too slow. These pawns are going to march and they're going to become a queen, because you have all the pieces working together, and this bishop is here and this pawn is here. They're not going to help the king. It's a king versus all of these pieces, and come on. What is he going to do? So now he goes knight to c6, because you're going to bring in your knight this way, and also you're going to win this pawn. There's nothing you can do to defend this pawn. This is actually the only move in this position that works. Anything else, actually, if you had played anything else, even g3, which looks like I'm getting 2 squares away from becoming a queen, this actually doesn't work. You have to play knight to c6. That's why Hans played knight to e5. He saw this. Then Magnus is going to take this pawn, and I put my pawn here. And, I put my knight here. And now, the pawn can't go up the board, because it's blocked by its own bishop, and there's nothing you can do to stop the knight taking the pawn. The bishop retreats, I take it, and I also win a tempo on your bishop. So your bishop, while it moves away, I push my pawn forward. The bishop tries to go one last desperation to win the pawn. He pushes the pawn again. Magnus just let his pawn get even further. They're so close. Knight coming in. And bishop goes here. Trying to control this diagonal. Magnus is just kind of stalling here. And he kind of traps the knight. As you can see, the knight can't exit anywhere. That's one good thing. But it's completely useless because your bishop has to stay on this square to keep the knight trapped. And it can't stay on that square because these two pawns are marching up. What are you going to do? And then Hans plays king to e5. And Magnus Carlsen resigns this game because I attack your bishop has to move, you can go anywhere, does not matter, bishop g2, but you're gonna lose this game. It's completely done. There's nothing you can do. Two pawns marching up the board. Now the knight is free. He's gonna come in any way he wants. All of these work. These two pawns just cool, calm, collectively go here. And yeah, you're gonna win this game because now you have the two pawns that are gonna march. You can't stop any of these, and it's a win. So clearly a very great game by Hans Nieman. Magnus Carlsen, I will personally say, did play a bit weak on this game. So yeah, he wasn't on his top performance level, clearly. Considering he was the white pieces, for those of you who don't know, when you're playing a classical game and you have the white pieces, you're set to have a small advantage. As you can see, the engine already gives a bit of an advantage, even more if you play e4. So yeah, this is already sort of, when you're playing sort of a 17-year-old and you're the GOAT, kind of everybody expects you to win with the white pieces. So everybody thought Magnus would win the white pieces, or somehow Hans would clinch a draw. But no, Hans Nieman wins with the black pieces in the Field Cup. And in great style, he had to find some great moves. I mean, this knight to f1 move was very, very key. He had to find knight to c6 to win this pawn. Knight f3, this fork was, okay, this one was obvious. King to g6 was actually a very good move. Because I'm going to be honest, maybe I would have played king to e5 here and I would have assumed this is fine. But apparently after takes and takes, this is, you know, fine. So some very good moves Hans had to find, but ultimately he was better in this game and he did win the game. So yeah, I mean, it was a very tough game, but he ended up victorious. And then as you can see, 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, Magnus Carlsen accused Hans Nieman for cheating publicly, and as you can see, this is the statement he gave. As you can see, he's saying, we must do something about cheating, and for my part going forward, I don't want to play against people that have cheated repeatedly in the past because I don't know what they are capable of doing in the future. So yeah, clearly Magnus has some very strong opinions about this, but as I said, we're not here for the drama, we are here for the chess. So I hope you all were able to learn from this game some very key ideas, improve on your own chess, and see how Hans Nieman was able to win this game. And remember, this is written in chess history as probably the most important, one of the most important games. Unfortunately not maybe for the quality of chess, but definitely one of the most important. As you can see, you'll find hundreds of articles on this drama. So yeah, as I said, I really hope you guys learned from this, and hopefully I'll see you guys back in the future. For more videos, I'm going to be hopefully uploading and just posting more educational videos. And if you guys also want to learn live classes with other students, a very interactive class where we all discuss and analyze positions and learn very good strategies and tactics, you can always contact me. My email is in the channel description. If you ever want to join those classes, I'd be very happy. And once you email, you can expect a reply within 1 to 2 days, very fast. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and hopefully we'll see you back for more. Take care.